Donald Trump called him tough. Rush Limbaugh read one of his articles live on his radio show. Ann Coulter tweeted that article to her 1.5 million followers and declared, "Every sentence is perfect." Ladies and gentlemen, your host, former chief editor of the Jewish Press, Elliot Resnick.
Welcome to the Elliot Resnick Show. COVID-19 vaccines and masks are necessary for children. That's what all the experts say. Human-induced global warming is clearly ruining the planet. That's what all the experts say. But quote-unquote all the experts are wrong in these two instances, which makes you wonder if they aren't wrong in other instances too. Our guest today, Nina Teicholz, spent 9 years researching the quote-unquote accepted fact that saturated fat is bad for you, and came away learning not only that quote-unquote all the experts are wrong, but that the consensus on saturated fat was reached much the same way that the consensus on COVID-19 vaccines and global warming was reached. That is, by intellectual bullying and the demonization and isolation of critics. The result of Teicholz's research is a book called The Big Fat Surpirse: Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet, which amazingly became a New York Times bestseller when it came out in 2014, and has been praised by the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, the Chicago Sun-Times, and the Boston Globe. And Malcolm Gladwell, for all you Gladwell fans out there, wrote about Teicholz's book, quote, "blew my mind," end quote. Personally speaking, The Big Fat Surpirse is one of the most fascinating and eye-opening books I have ever read. I'd love to give you more details, but I don't want to steal Nina Teicholz's thunder. So without further ado, I will introduce today's guest. Welcome to the Elliot Resnick Show.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. You argue in the book that fat, and particularly saturated fat, is not bad for you. Give us the elevator pitch version of your argument, if you would, but pretend we're in a 90-story building. So instead of the 30-second version, perhaps give us the 3-minute version.
All right. So the idea that saturated fat and dietary cholesterol, which are found primarily in dairy, meat, and eggs, that these foods are bad for you goes back to the 1950s when a physiologist by the name of Ancel Keys at the University of Minnesota, he proposed this idea that saturated fat and cholesterol, that they would cause your blood cholesterol to go up and that would cause your arteries to clog, sort of like hot oil down a cold stovepipe, and that this would cause a heart attack. This was called the diet heart hypothesis. And Ancel Keys really came to the fore when President Eisenhower in 1955, he had a heart attack. Heart disease had been relatively rare in America, with almost very few cases documented in the early 1900s to be the leading cause of death in the 1950s, and nobody knew what caused heart disease. So it was a sort of panic in the nation because it was this leading killer. There were a number of hypotheses about what might cause heart disease, but it was Ancel Keys' hypothesis, called the diet heart hypothesis, that saturated fat and dietary cholesterol cause heart disease, that won the day. He really stepped into this vacuum of lack of explanation that existed, and it was his idea that filled it. And what really solidified this as policy, and the reason that we still have this idea today, is that Ancel Keys joined the Nutrition Committee of the American Heart Association, which was really the only public health authority that was making policy about heart disease at the time. And he was able to get the American Heart Association to put forward and publish a policy in 1961 telling American men, at the time it was only men, and later expanded to include women, but telling them to avoid saturated fat and dietary cholesterol as their best measure of protection against heart disease. And that was really sort of the acorn that grew into the giant oak tree of advice that we have today. But the fundamental problem that I discovered through my near decade of research that went into writing my book was that there was almost no rigorous evidence at the time of that 1961 recommendation, and that subsequent clinical trials, the sort of grade A, most rigorous type of evidence that shows cause and effect relationships, the clinical trials that were done all over the world in subsequent decades on some 76,000 people, none of them could conclusively show that saturated fat and dietary cholesterol could cause heart disease. So they were sort of what we call in science null results. They could not support Ancel Keys' hypothesis. But it was the case that when these trial results came in, it was sort of already too late. This idea, which was so powerful and had become enshrined as official policy, not only at the American Heart Association, but later by the US Department of Agriculture and our dietary guidelines, this idea was so powerful that even data to the contrary, as it was published, was just not recognized. We can talk later about what's happened to that data today. There has been sort of a sea change in thinking on saturated fats, but it was a theory that came to be official policy without sufficient evidence, and then has been very hard, or indeed almost impossible, to roll back despite evidence to the contrary.
I think people perhaps are more open to such an argument now than they would have been maybe 2 or 3 years ago, because I think they saw so much politicization of science during the COVID pandemic. Whatever stance you take on masks and vaccines and lockdowns, clearly there was more than just pure science going on. And I think people perhaps are more open to such an argument. And I was reading in another book where someone was arguing that science is supposed to be this pure pursuit of truth, but he said at the end of the day, scientists are like us. Just like we have egos, scientists have egos. Just like it's hard for us to admit that we're wrong, it's hard for scientists to admit that we're wrong. And I was thinking about this argument. I realized it's actually much harder for them to admit we're wrong. If we have to admit we're wrong to our spouse, to our friend, that's one person to another person. When scientists have to admit they're wrong, they have to admit they're wrong to millions of people. They have to admit that 10 years of research it's much harder in a way.
It's absolutely true. I mean, you have a very good point. And there's a term for it, which is called intellectual bias, that once you invest years and years of your life and your research and your publication history, and everything is invested in a certain hypothesis, a certain idea, it becomes extremely difficult to acknowledge or admit that there might be anything wrong with that idea. It's your entire life's work really at stake. And in the case of saturated fat and cholesterol, and in the case of nutrition science generally, there's this added layer of immobility, let's say, or an inability to respond to new data, new evidence, because you have invested in food and foodstuffs the entire multinational food system. So all the food corporations and Kellogg's and Nestle and Procter and Gamble, and in addition to them, actually the pharmaceutical companies who who have a stake in whether people are sick or not sick, and you have sort of the inability for large institutions. You have the U.S. government, the American Heart Association. If it's hard for a professor at Harvard to admit he or she is wrong, how much harder is it for an entire institution to backtrack on their policy when, in fact, these are institutions that hold the public trust? This is, I think, quite similar to what we're seeing with COVID, that the loss of public trust is a crisis for these institutions. And there's possibilities even of liability if they've gotten very basic recommendations wrong and have known about it.
Right. I just want to tease out a teeny bit about the politicization of science. So you write in the book, I think from the very beginning, there were people who said this hypothesis that fat is bad for you or saturated fat is bad for you doesn't make sense to us. What happened to those type of people? Some of these people, I think, were top experts in their field, correct?
Yes, and that's a really important point. There were numerous critics of Ansel Keys because, of course, it's a natural question to think, like, okay, there's this very strong individual, Ansel Keys. He was very aggressive about his ideas. He would, according to his colleagues, argue anyone to the death, but he was one man. And what happened in the field of science, there should have been a healthy debate going on. And in fact, in the 1960s and 70s, there was. There were top people in the field. There was somebody from the Rockefeller University in New York. There was another scientist at Vanderbilt University, and there was somebody else from Texas A&M who criticized and published detailed critiques of the diet heart hypothesis. But there was such vigorous pushback against these critics because remember, Ansel Keys came to be backed by the National Institutes of Health, the American Heart Association, eventually the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He had very powerful forces behind him. And the people who spoke out against him and were his critics were their ideas were really beaten down. And there was a certain aspect of sort of almost bullying that went on in nutrition scientists. So these scientists who would step out, they would be criticized in a very personal ad hominem way, which was completely surprising to me when I found this when doing my research, because like you, I thought, oh, science is the calm, rational moving forward of ideas, thesis, antithesis. But it really wasn't that, which is that when ideas threatened Ansel Keys, he would viciously attack his opponents. And eventually those opponents, they sort of had their lifeblood of taken away from them in the sense that they saw their research grants disappear. They were disinvited from conferences, or they just stopped getting invitations. Their ability to do science became difficult, and they became an example to other scientists who decided they were not going to speak out about the low fat diet or saturated fats. And ultimately, by about the mid 1980s, the critics really had given up, I would say. So they're really, at that point, the debate over saturated fat really goes silent up until about 2010.
Okay, I want to go back because I might be jumping a teeny bit ahead of the audience. I read the book, but a lot of other people obviously have not. So I just want to get back to some basic facts, which, because some people might say, why should I trust Nina Teicholz's views over the experts' views? So I want to just get some facts which are not disputed, if I'm not mistaken. One of them is that the rate of heart disease among the French is low, despite the fact they have tremendous consumption of high-fat cheese. So the idea is that saturated fat is bad for you, and the French are having all this cheese, they would be having a lot of heart disease, and yet they're not, right? That's not disputed.
That's not disputed. And in fact, that has been called the French paradox, but you can see it in other countries that had high saturated fat consumption, such as Switzerland and Germany. High saturated fat consumption, low rates of heart disease. And you actually can see that in many countries across the world. There are a great many so-called paradoxes in this area.
And the mainstream experts just ignore this evidence. What do they do with it?
Yes, they ignore that evidence in the same way that they ignore the results from those clinical trials I described earlier. There has been a kind of denial of evidence to the contrary. They simply don't look at it. They don't reckon with it. They've ignored a great deal of evidence that disproves their ideas, and that really continues until this day. I mean, we can talk about that. I'll just leave it at that.
Well, maybe we'll go back to that. Just another fact which I think is important, and there are many in your book, and I really would encourage everyone in the audience to read your book. But you also note that many primitive, isolated peoples in the 20th century had very low rates of heart disease, despite eating a tremendous amount of meat and fish, and only saw their rates of heart disease increase when Westerners arrived on their shores and introduced them to sugar and refined carbohydrates. Is that also correct?
Yes, that is correct. There's numerous populations. In fact, there are the Inuit in Greenland, and also in the Arctic Circle in Canada, who were documented to eat a diet of 70 to 80% saturated fat with very, very low or non-existent rates of heart disease. There was a similar population in Kenya called the Maasai that were studied by scientists from the University of Vanderbilt, also documented to eat enormous amounts of saturated fat. Their diet was mainly meat and milk. And they actually took an electrocardiograph machine out to their tribal areas and could find virtually zero evidence of a heart attack. I think there was one case that might have been a heart attack, but they took data on some 400 individuals and they couldn't find any evidence, despite having a diet that, we would think should kill us, clog our arteries and kill us. So, and those are not isolated populations. Those are just a couple of examples, not to say that we should all eat this way, but just to show there's striking evidence to the contrary.
Okay, and then one more example, which also I think is intriguing, should at least cause people to think. You point out that obesity was not such a big problem in this country until roughly when we actually started having much less fat and more of everything else.
Yes, I mean, our obesity rates turned sharply upwards in 1980, which is also the same year that the federal government started telling everybody to eat a low-fat diet. If you reduce the fat in your diet, there are only 3 macronutrients in food: fat, protein, carbohydrate. Humans tend to regulate more or less the amount of protein that they eat to keep it at a fairly constant level. But if you reduce the fat, the only other macronutrient that you can sort of eat is carbohydrate. And if you think about it, if you're not having red meat for dinner, what are you having? You're having pasta, or you're having another kind of grain. And of course, all the low fat foods that came swarming into our economy, into our food, into our supermarkets. So there has been an increase in 274 calories per day that Americans consumed. I think this data is from maybe 2017 compared to 1980, but all of those calories are carbohydrates. So we've vastly increased the amount of grains and sugars that we eat. And that was always an alternative explanation for heart disease and obesity that goes back to a professor in Imperial College in England named John Yudkin, who wrote a book about it. And he thought that sugar and refined carbohydrates were really the problem. And he was a contemporary of Ansel Keys and was a threat to Ansel Keys. And as a result, Ansel Keys, when he heard about John Yudkin's idea about sugar, he he vigorously attacked John Yudkin and accused him of being backed by the food industry. So just going back to the point of, there are competing hypotheses. They should be debated in the open, and yet there's a kind of vicious attack that goes on among scientists.
And obesity levels have risen how much since 1980, roughly?
The obesity rates in the late 70s were in the low to mid teens, so 13, 15% of the population. Obesity is now at over 43% of the population. That's with people with obesity, not just overweight. Overweight and obesity together is some 2/3 of our population now. There's just an
Wow.
enormous increase, and those numbers are a little outdated. I think post COVID and the lockdowns, those numbers would be higher, and everything is still going in the wrong direction.
One explanation, which I'm sure you've heard a million times, is well, maybe now in the modern age, we're behind computers all day long, we're not walking at all. Maybe that's why we're more obese.
And that seems like a reasonable explanation. It's just that when they have done studies on exercise and tried to use that as a means to reduce obesity, those experiments have not been successful. It turns out that for at least for sort of moderate aerobic exercise, such as even training for a marathon, which was the subject of one clinical trial and experimental test that they conducted, they could not get people to lose weight in the group that trained to run a marathon over the course of a year compared to the group that did nothing and made no change. And that turns out to be the case for kind of moderate intensity exercise because your body adjusts and it adjusts to the increased caloric demands, and it will increase your hunger levels, your food intake, in order to compensate. So it just turns out that exercise is not the panacea that we thought for weight loss. And that actually has been recognized in official government reports where they say that, there's a reluctance to give up on this idea that you can just burn away your calories, but it just hasn't been borne out in experimental tests.
Interesting. Okay, so in your book, you argue more or less that it's not fat that's the enemy. If anything, it's probably sugar or refined carbohydrates. I had one question on that because one of the theses in your book is that if you go back to people before they were affected by modernity in the West, they seem to have lower rates of heart disease. So I get that sugar is kind of like a new addition to our diet, but carbohydrates obviously are not. Bread is there from the dawn of civilization. So if how could bread be the problem? I get why sugar might be the problem. How would bread be the problem, though?
That's an excellent question because there obviously are populations who have been healthy and not obese or not had high obesity rates who ate high levels of carbohydrates in their diet. Whether you're talking about the Scottish and eating a lot of starches or the Japanese eating a lot of rice. And I think that I don't know the exact answer to that, but I think that there's something about the increasing levels of processing of carbohydrates, the refinement of carbohydrates. I mean, a very simple example is that the effects of eating an apple are very different than when you process apples into apple juice. That has a much greater impact on your blood sugar levels. Sugar may be sort of like putting a match to the fire of obesity, where if you add sugar to the diet, it may increase the sort of the negative effects of having blood sugar spikes. I don't think we actually have a complete answer to that conundrum. But what we do have is a really significant number of clinical trials now that show when people reduce their carbohydrates, it's really the total carbohydrates that seems to be most effective. They will see their blood pressure go down, all their lipids, virtually all the markers of inflammation and their cholesterol markers that implicate heart disease, all of those improve, and you see some modest improvements in obesity, weight control. Certainly, that diet seems to be better than one that restricts fat in terms of reducing weight. But I think it's important to understand that when you're a healthy person and you're slim, you can eat a lot of different foods. Once you have tipped over into metabolic unhealth of some kind, you have obesity, you have a high blood pressure, you have diabetes, At that point, there needs to be a more restricted diet, restricted in carbohydrates principally, that can reverse that disease process. So people with these conditions have to eat differently than people who are healthy and well.
I'm curious, how in the world did your book become a New York Times bestseller? Considering that your views are so out of the main.
I think, the week before my book came out, I had the front page story in the Wall Street Journal opinion pages, the opinion piece, and there was just a huge amount of interest. That story was the most shared story in the Wall Street Journal's recent history at that point in time in 2014. And I think there was just tremendous interest in this idea that maybe saturated fats weren't bad for you, and we had gotten it wrong on saturated fats. I was lucky that the month before my book came out, there was a major review of all the evidence on saturated fats that came out. Its authors included people from Harvard and Cambridge, and that paper concluded that the evidence did not show that saturated fat caused heart disease. So that had sort of primed the ground, if you will, to for people to be more perhaps receptive to the sort of message that I had found over the course of years and years of research.
Interesting. Now, I know you're involved now in efforts to try to get the government to change its guidelines. You and several and other colleagues of yours. You haven't been so successful. Is it because of, like, this Keys person from the 1950s? There's just one or two people on top who are very powerful. I mean, it's hard to believe that all these people in charge of making these recommendations are they also blind? They're also unwilling to admit they're wrong. I mean,
Well, the US dietary guidelines is a government policy that's issued by the US Department of Agriculture and the Department of Health and Human Services. It's like trying to turn the Titanic. It's an enormously influential policy. All federally funded nutrition programs take their guidance from the dietary guidelines. It informs $800 billion in feeding assistance programs like school lunches, feeding programs for the elderly. I mean, there are enormous financial interests at stake here. You're talking about that this policy has an impact on every sector of the food industry. And it's been around for 40 years and it has never been challenged before. So I think it would be unrealistic to expect that they would simply change on a dime. I think it's a long process of trying to educate people about a science that, let's face it, for many years this science was lost and was not known. And it's taken sort of my work to unearth it and the work of others to bring this to light. And so that is, I think it's a process of educating people. And also, I mean, to be honest, really, we're up against huge financial interests. So I think, it's really sort of a David and Goliath kind of struggle. But it's not that I'm not without optimism. I mean, we did make progress. We have been able to get them they had a plan to further reduce the caps on saturated fats, which, due to the experts that we brought before the USDA officials, we were able to stop that. So, and we're encouraging them to review evidence on the low carbohydrate diet, which they haven't done in a rigorous way to date. So, I think it's still possible. The science is advancing so rapidly, and it will be impossible to ignore this science forever.
interesting. Is Dr. Fauci at all involved?
Not that I know of.
Is it a similar process though, like where one or two very powerful men control, or women, I don't know, control the grants and control the powerful journals, and they have power? Is that same type of dynamic at play? Where if you anger the wrong people, you're not going to get your grants and you're not going to get invited to conferences, even till today, not just the 1950s, and therefore some people will just not speak up for that reason.
I think that's absolutely still the case. Yes. I mean, there's definitely a favored hypothesis about what causes good health. So, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, low fat dairy, lean meat, that's the dietary guidelines. And that is the favored diet for people at the National Institutes of Health and the leading universities. And so, for instance, people who have been trying to research diets lower in carbohydrates have had a lot of trouble getting their studies funded by the National Institutes of Health. So that definitely persists, and those researchers are really not invited to many of the mainstream conferences. I think there is definitely a political dynamic in probably most areas of science where if there's a hypothesis that has virtually become a kind of dogma, it is extremely hard to be an outlier and still have a vibrant scientific and intellectual career.
I wonder if you have any opinions on vaccines. I'll be perfectly honest. Before COVID, I was, I thought like most people, the anti-vaxxers were a bit nuts. But I'm much more open to their view now. Between your book and also what I saw over the last 2.5 years, I watched a little bit with Bobby Kennedy Jr. and I see like he raises a lot of legitimate questions, and it's very disturbing how they're always just shut down so vigorously, like not scientifically and soberly, but like almost like personally, like you're saying. That I'm at least like sort of open to some of their views now or some of their questions. I'm wondering if you also started being more open to their view without coming to a conclusion, just open to their views based on your own research, based on COVID and whatnot.
Well, I think that the lockdowns, the masks, the vaccines, they have a very kind of eerily similar story to the to what we see in the area of nutrition science, and in the sense that there's virtually no healthy scientific debate going on about these issues. I mean, regardless of what you conclude about these, the science behind these issues or what the evidence base or the cost benefit analyses or whatever it is, what we see is that people who raise critical objections about the science, their voices are not heard, and worse, I mean, I think it's fair to say they're silent. They're just, people are getting canceled and thrown off social media, and when I see an area that is not being openly discussed, and there is not even a reckoning with different viewpoints, that sends alarm bells into my head throughout my mind, because I saw what happened in nutrition science, and I saw how sort of methodically critical voices were, how they were marginalized, and I see the same phenomenon happening around the issues that are so important in COVID. So I just don't understand why our public health officials or many in the media, I don't understand why they're just not reckoning with some of these alternative viewpoints, because it would make their own argument much more convincing. If you cannot face your critics and talk rationally to them, it weakens your own position. I think that's what we're seeing here. And it's why that public health institutions are wavering in the public trust.
People become more suspicious. Even if you're right, they become more suspicious.
Exactly. That's it. I just wanted to, I don't know if you're going to ask this question, but I want to put in a coda about saturated fat, since we were talking about it earlier. And it's just an important chapter in the history of saturated fat. So we talked about the early introduction of that hypothesis by Ansel Keys, the testing of it in clinical trials whose results did not favor the diet hard hypothesis, did not support it, but were not just, those results sort of were not recognized, disappeared. They became what's known as silent studies. But I want to add a positive note here at the end, which is that due to my work and also the work of Gary Taubes and other journalists, starting in 2010, scientists from around the world in independent groups of researchers started reviewing that clinical trial data that had been those trials that had been conducted in the 60s and 70s. And there are now more than 20 different review papers that have all concluded that there is insufficient evidence to justify continued caps on saturated fats. So this is really a complete shift in the scientific thinking on saturated fats. And those papers have been published in a number of different journals, but one of them is the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, which is a very prestigious journal. And it was called a state of the art review by the journal editors themselves. And it was named one of the best papers of the year by the editor in chief of that journal. And its authors included several former dietary advisory committee members. In other words, the people who had made the policy for the government. These authors were now on a paper saying we got that wrong. So this is at the very highest level confirming that we misinterpreted or didn't reckon with important data on saturated fats, and that we should now cease to vilify them. There's no reason to limit their consumption. This is not to say we should all go out and eat sticks of butter, but it's just saying let's just let them out of jail. We thought we had evidence against them, but it turns out that evidence was very weak. And so there's no further justification to keep them in jail. And that evidence And all those 20 plus papers have really not been recognized by policymakers and by the experts who are in control of our official policies. And so it's just really a job of trying to get that science to be heard. But the science definitely exists. There's almost no science to the contrary anymore.
Interesting. So you're saying there's hope. That's good. Just as the last question, so what would you advise for your average person, someone like listening to this podcast, if they agree with you, or if they buy your book and they agree with you, could they do as a layman?
I think that educating their own doctors, providing them with, if not my book, then other materials, finding those papers, and bringing a stack of papers to their doctors, and I think doctors are not exposed to this information. They're the most important gatekeepers for our medical advice, and they really don't know about this information. Bringing them that journal article from the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, the state of the art review, and say, what do you think about this? I mean, that's just something that people can do in their everyday lives to try to persuade their friend or neighbor or doctor. And beyond that, they can know they should not avoid foods with saturated fats in order to protect themselves against heart disease. So instead of saying, oh, I'll buy the low fat cheese with low fat milk, instead buy the regular, normal version. You can't milk non-fat milk from a cow, and instead, maybe think twice before having another bread roll or having cereal for breakfast. Like, there's no harm in having eggs instead.
Right. That's not only no harm. I think you also argue in your book. I'm sorry to add one more thing. That there's always a trade-off. It's not like you're just eliminating meat and having nothing. You're eliminating meat and then increasing carbohydrates, and you're arguing that you're safer having the meat or the eggs than you are having the carbohydrates. Correct?
Yes, I think there's no question that what you're trying to do in your for your own personal health is avoid having those blood sugar spikes. If you have granola or oatmeal for breakfast, your blood sugar will be go way up. There's a huge spike following that kind of food or any kind of cereal. If you have eggs cooked in butter, no spike. Plus, those eggs are actually one of the most nutritious foods that you can possibly have. There are all these vitamins and minerals that you really need in order for your brain and your body to function correctly. Whereas granola or oatmeal have virtually no nutrients that are indigenous to those foods. Sometimes they're added through supplemented nutrients, but the real natural nutrients come from whole foods. And so choosing foods that are nutrient dense, that contain nutrients, and that don't spike your blood sugar is a very good rule of thumb for choosing a healthy diet.
Okay. Well, thank you so very much for your time. I really appreciate it,
Thank you so much for having me.
and continued good luck in your work.
Thank you.
All right, that does it for us. Stay tuned for next week's episode, for which we will be interviewing best-selling author and journalist Denise McAllister, otherwise known as the woman whom Ben Shapiro canceled. Yes, you heard that right. Ben Shapiro canceled someone for the crime of defending biblical values before a Twitter mob. In the meantime, have a great day or night, depending on when you're listening to this podcast. And don't forget to visit our website, 1vs450.com. That's 1vs450.com, where, among other things, you can watch dozens of 2-minute opinion videos, read Avigdor Miller's controversial opinions on all sorts of issues, and scroll to the bottom of the page and join our email list.